Thank you very much. Actually, people lately have been saying I look like Bernie Sanders. And Lauren and I last night drew straws, and I got the short one, so I'll be presenting, but she will be joining me during the Q&A at the end of this conference. In some ways, I'm not a psychologist, I'm actually a sociologist, and so I'm going to try to sort of put a sociological and more communal lens on the issue of trauma. As was stated, in 1993, Lauren and I published a book that was based on a few more than 100 interviews. The survivors that we interviewed during a period of about 15 years averaged, if you look just at what their age was in 1915, between sort of 9 and 11 years of age. They were all elderly people. They were being interviewed 60 plus years after the genocide, which I think makes a huge difference, actually, in terms of how we as outsiders or second or third generation individuals experience trauma. In 2001, Lauren and I were invited to a major conference in Kigali, Rwanda, that was on genocides of the 20th century. And because of the age of elderly survivors, none of them were able to attend or to give witness and testimony. So Lauren and I were invited to represent them. And that actually led to a love affair that we then have continued with orphans of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. And also right to just in September, we were back in Rwanda. We've sort of lost count, well over 15 times. And so in the context of that particular project, we've done about 260 interviews. The last 100 interviews are all on videotape, and I'm going to show you two very short clips in just a moment from those interviews. And I think it's the experience of, for almost 15 years, being able to continually live with survivors of a very current genocide that has given us perspective on the Armenian genocide. Actually, Lorna oftentimes has said to me, she understands her own father, who out of a family of 9, only he and his sister survived. She understands him better because she's been able to see orphans, Rwandan orphans, and what they have experienced. It must have been many of the same things that her own father experienced. In Rwanda then, we witnessed PTSD, which has been referenced several times in its very raw form. When we first went to Rwanda, it was only 7 years after the genocide. That very much contrasts with survivors who were giving witness or testimony who were in their 70s and 80s. They were, of course, reflecting back on childhood experiences. But in a lot of ways, I think this comparative analysis that I want to do this afternoon, each genocide informs the other, and of course this afternoon we'll be hearing a paper that deals with the Jewish Holocaust. Now, some comparisons. I think most of you in this audience are well aware of some of the basic facts of the Armenian genocide, the deportations, the hunger, the thirst, the exposure, the disease, the massacres that took lives. And the fact that at the end of World War I, there were very few Armenians who were actually left in Turkey. They had migrated to Lebanon, to Syria, and places around the world. Now, if we look at the Rwanda Tutsi genocide, which you may not be as familiar with, that genocide happened in a very short and compressed period of time, literally in 100 days. And in 100 days, more than 800,000 people were killed. And actually, the vast majority of those were killed in the first month and 6 weeks. They were killed in extremely brutal ways, with machetes, with clubs, sometimes with grenades. And in contrast with the Armenian case, after the genocide, the survivors, these Tutsi survivors, were living amongst the very people who had perpetrated the genocide on them. Now, some comparisons and some parallels. We've already heard about rape in the Armenian case. In the Rwanda case, of the interviews that we've done with widows, with women survivors, I would estimate that almost half of them had been raped during those 100 days, and a very substantial percentage of those women were infected with AIDS or HIV. In terms of religion, it's very important to note that in the Rwandan case, it was Christians who were killing Christians. This was a tribal conflict between Hutu, who were the majority population in Rwanda, and Tutsi. But there are parallels not only in these two genocides, but I would say in all genocides, that in order to do this kind of mass killing, there has to be propaganda. In both the Armenian and Rwandan case, a racist ideology. Tutsis were viewed regularly on the media and called cockroaches, snakes. Obviously in the Armenian case, Turks labeled Armenians as gavurs and so forth, because you really need to dehumanize people before you can kill them. Also, in both of these two genocides, they happened in the context of war. Obviously, the Armenian genocide in the context of the First World War, in the case of Rwanda, in the context of a civil war. Now, I want to just, if this will play, can we have the sound up?
Twikize inzoka tuzirangize tujye kureba n'izindi ndabyibuka ikintu baravuze ngo bahere ku bakuru urebye ni twari turimo turi abana babiri ewana bamama babishe urubozo rwa nabi bashiki banjye harimo wari unteruye kubera nari nananiwe babarangiye ngo anteruyemo iki ati bisi bya byana byo kwa Gasongo bikiriho ati muracyariho shati isona nyoko barapfuye nibwo nahise numva ko banapfuye sister baramufashe baramukata izosi bamwesha amaraso barambwira ngo ni nyamwe ngo barambabarira nyamwe numva ko bari bumbabarire babakorera yafura mbi ndabyibukana nanjye baherukije ku buryo batemye no mupanga wa mbere nahise ndyama sinjya no kumva ubu buhiri bubiri bundi bakwisemo bakongera bagatema na hano ntabyo numvise.
I want to say that's not an extreme testimony by any means. The next testimony, just so that you hear the voice of a widow, a woman, deals with the issue of rape.
Arigihe babikoraga ari benshi kugira ngo bagushinyagure kuko hari nabo bateraniraga hari benshi bagapfa kubera ibyo bintu abandi barangiza bakabashoramo ibiti bakabica babishinyaguriye.
And you were raped too. No, bakufashe.
Ubwo no kuvuga ngo jewe nari nabohoshwe n'umuntu umwe w'umugabo ubwo arangije undi nawe aramunyambura nawe aranjyana nyuma yaho naho njya kujyana n'abandi babiri b'abahungu gutyo.
In the interviews that we did with Armenian survivors, it was actually indicated earlier, oftentimes euphemisms were used to refer to rape, and as Lorna can tell you, oftentimes women would ask either for the tape recorder to be turned off or after the interview is done, then they would refer to rape. It's more difficult to know the percentage of Armenian women who were raped, but certainly rape has been used as an instrument of genocide in many genocides. Now, in the case of Armenians, I think there are a lot of mitigating factors that are important to look at when one examines the topic of trauma. One, as I've already mentioned, it occurred 60 years later. Armenian survivors had migrated to a variety of places. They had families, they had employment in most instances. They had evolved organizations, churches, political groups. And the thing that struck me very powerfully was that particularly early in our marriage, we could not go to a gathering of elderly Armenians except that they seemed to be always talking about the genocide in one way or another. So I think catharsis actually has played a very important role. Now, Shakeh already mentioned the 6 responses to Armenian survivors that we detail in our book, so I'm not going to go through those. But in terms of Rwanda survivors, there are definitely PTSD symptoms that we observed. Hyperarousal. Almost all of the survivors we've interviewed talked about insomnia, how they're easily startled, how they have difficulty concentrating if they're students in school, and otherwise sort of focusing on immediate tasks. Intrusion, also something that was previously mentioned. Survivors repeatedly talked about flashbacks. They're constantly reliving the trauma of the events that they experienced in 1994. Dissociation, numbness, sort of a detachment, not being there emotionally, sometimes almost sort of flights to another place in the midst of a conversation, and avoidance. Some of these perhaps I can give examples of, or Lorna can, in the Q&A period. But on April 7th, the day of commemoration of the Rwandan genocide, many survivors actually either do not attend, or in a lot of instances at events that we've been to, there will be survivors that will be fainting, even in very large gatherings in stadiums and so forth, and medics will need to carry them out. Now, I don't have time to give examples, but perhaps during the Q&A we can give some examples of how we've experienced trauma among Rwandese. Compounding factors, and I'm just going to make a list here. After the genocide, most of the survivors, I would say well over 90%, were unemployed. Their means of livelihood had been destroyed. Their houses had been destroyed. Many of them had severe injuries. There were a lot of amputations because of the machetes that had cut them. Lonely. We interviewed a number of survivors where they were the only survivor of their entire, not nuclear family, but extended family. And all social and government institutions had to be rebuilt. Now, there have been a variety of ways that Rwanda, which actually right now is quite a prosperous country, and actually a very safe country to travel in, where the government has tried to sort of process this trauma through what are called gacaca courts, or sort of a village justice system where prisoners confess what they've done, and then are given some kind of community service to deal with their crime. There are numerous accounts where during these gacaca courts or trials, perpetrators have indicated where the people are buried that they killed. And so survivors have been able to exhume these bodies, have washed the bones, and have given them a proper burial, something that has been very, very healing to them. There are commemorations actually all over Rwanda. There are places that have been especially located where there are bodies buried and are sacred places, remembering what happened during that genocide. And also, now that we have sort of been spending almost 15 years interacting with survivors, it's very clear that education, marriage, these are very important in terms of sort of rebuilding a sense of confidence and dignity, and also some sense of a life that has a future to it. Let me very briefly mention something about survivor organizations, and I'll take one in particular, namely Solace Ministries, which is the location where we did the 100 interviews. It was started by a survivor about 20 years ago. They have 60 different groups around the country, but what I want to focus on is the fact that they are really committed to listening, hearing, comforting survivors. And the healing that has been experienced by these survivors is done not in individual therapy, but in a communal setting. Every Wednesday, they have meetings attended by anywhere from 80 to 100 people in these different locations, where there is an opportunity to testify. By that they mean to give witness to what happened. And oftentimes someone will stand, will only be able to utter a few sentences, will break into tears, and then will have to sit down. But over time, they're able to actually tell their story in a public way, in a public setting. And that is surrounded by singing and dancing and affirmative words that there is a future for you. This particular organization has become a surrogate family for survivors. Literally, surviving males have become fathers to the fatherless, widows have become mothers to the orphans. They take a very holistic approach to what they do. Now I think I have just a very short video, 30 seconds or so, that will show you many of the same survivors that we personally interviewed dancing. And it's almost unbelievable that they could move from a setting of telling their stories filled with tears, filled with sorrow, but I want you just to witness this very briefly. Okay, so how am I doing my time? Have I about used up my 30 minutes?
Not yet.
Oh, good, okay. So I want to just say something about the power of community to heal. Telling your story to people who will carry the burden with you. We've seen that repeatedly in the context of this particular organization where we've done our interviews. Survivors developing a narrative about their experience rather than simply fragmented, revolving thoughts. Also a very important element of the process of healing. Being treated with dignity and respect. That is in some ways something that only a community can give to people. Again, that's the point I want to make, is the power of community to heal. And also, interestingly, survivors repeatedly said there was something comforting in being in the company of people who had experienced even worse things than they themselves had. In a sense, it almost relativized to a degree their experience. But again, being with fellow survivors in this communal setting is very important. And the book that we're just finishing actually focuses a lot on the issue of forgiveness. What we have started to realize is forgiveness is not for the perpetrator. Forgiveness is actually for the person, the victim, who has experienced these things. And there's a sense in which in the very act of forgiveness, it's a way of liberating oneself from those revolving thoughts that continue to haunt most survivors. Let me make a brief comparison to the post-genocide experience of Armenian survivors. Orphanages have already been referenced. These, I think, were very healing, communal experiences in which surrogate families were created, basic needs were met, people were educated, including in the trades, and they were then sent off once they got to a certain age as people who could be self-sufficient. Migration, I think very important that Armenians were not living with the perpetrators, except of course for those who had been taken as brides and were still living in Turkey. The amazing resilience of these survivors. Lorna and I would oftentimes comment to each other after an interview where we had heard the kinds of things that Carla in her video was showing you, and yet they seemed to have a gentleness of spirit, a sense of purpose. They were, in a sense, oftentimes vicariously living through their children who they were educating and caring for. And the role of writing one's biography. Lorna's father, near the very last part of his life, I think was inspired by the fact that we had interviewed him, and he sat down to write his own autobiography. And there was something about putting together all of these pieces of his life. In his book, he actually has conversations with his brothers and sisters who were murdered. And it was clear that this was an act of healing for him. So just to conclude, there is a sense in which time heals, but as we've seen with the Rwandan survivors, many of them told us that they had contemplated suicide after the genocide, and some actually had attempted suicide. So time heals, but certainly not completely. We've repeatedly seen the role of school and of communal organizations. And some more statistical work that was done as part of our project. Those orphans who went to school are much less traumatized than those who did not, or who did not complete school. Also, we've seen there are a number of survivor organizations in Rwanda. Those have also played an extremely important role. And I think one could say the same thing in the Armenian case for political organizations, for churches, and so forth. Economic development, both at a personal level, but also at a national level. And as we're well aware, there are many countries, including the Congo and elsewhere, where massacres, genocides are currently happening. But I think it's very difficult, or at least it's a challenge, for people to go through a healing process when the structures of government and the possibility of economic advancement does not exist. I could say a lot about the role in Rwanda of the government, which has abolished any distinction between Tutsi and Hutu. We are all Rwandese, they say. And in a sense, they've almost mandated reconciliation between these two tribal groups. And finally, Lorna and I both, particularly in the Rwandan case, have ourselves experienced vicarious trauma. And it is something that it has not been easy for us, particularly when we were interviewing 2, 3, 4 people a day, to step away from those experiences and not feel helpless that we were not able to assist each of these individuals. And also, particularly in the case of the Armenian genocide, Lorna was doing a lot of these interviews during the time that our own children were very young. And it was almost like a mirror image. Our own children could have been the very children of these elderly survivors who were explaining what happened to them in 1915. Thank you very much.